It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. So maybe you've heard that President Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have declared today economic D-Day. That's if Iran doesn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz and maybe do other things in the way the U.S. wants. Separately, the U.S. bond market had kind of an economic D-Day of its own last week, if you were paying attention, after the federal government's overall debt hit $40 trillion. So we'll talk in our first two segments today about the war and what this economic D-Day today is supposed to be, and then about the debt and the bond market. But weirdly, and you got to admit this is weird, no matter your politics, I think. Here's an exchange between President Trump and a reporter the other day as she asks what Trump will do if the U.S. economic strategy to buy back some U.S. Treasury debt doesn't calm the markets.
The yields have come back up since then. Have you talked to him about another type of intervention? Is that something he will be doing?
We have many types of intervention. That's one. The ultimate intervention is our military. And if we have to use that, we will, yeah.
Send in the military to address the national debt? Okay, then. We'll get to that with economic reporter Greg David later in the hour. But first, the war. President Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have declared today economic D-Day. That's if Iran doesn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz and maybe do other things in the way the U.S. wants. Bessent is holding a news conference today to detail what that will allegedly mean for Iran and for any country doing business with Iran, U.S. allies included. Here is Bessent previewing it a little bit last week on CNBC.
We do have control of the strait. You would have seen media reports that large amounts of energy are getting out, and I think that we can continue doing that in the southern lane, and that I think oil markets are misinterpreting what this economic pressure means. The economic pressure means that we are going to all of our allies, and this is going to be the greatest coordinated economic isolation in the history of the world. And we are going to them and saying, you are either with us or against us. You want this murderous regime to end. And if you insist on doing business with them, either transferring money, buying their oil, they are doing seaborne ship transfers, then the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. government, they will put its full might and force toward enforcing against you.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on CNBC. With me now is Yeganeh Torbati, covering the war and the region from Istanbul for the New York Times, and co-author of Stolen Revolution, Betrayal and Hope in Modern Iran, just published in June. Yeganeh, thanks so much for coming on. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You heard the Scott Bessent clip. What else can you tell us so far about what they mean by economic D-Day?
Well, I think we're all very curious to see what the U.S. is going to announce, but it is interesting to me. I mean, one, from what he said, it seems that the goal is now, again, some sort of regime change. For a while, the U.S. has been hoping to get the Strait of Hormuz reopened, but it seems like, again, we're sort of looking at kind of more expansive goals, at least according to what Secretary Bessent said in that clip. And I think the thing that I'll be looking out the most for is, what does this mean for China? And will these measures be enforced against China? President Donald Trump has tried to pursue a pretty good relationship with the Chinese government. But it is China that buys or bought, I guess, before the naval blockade, the vast majority of Iran's oil, even despite U.S. sanctions. It was kind of done through these underhanded ways, and it wasn't kind of officially on the books, but that is kind of what the reporting tells us, is that Chinese refineries had been buying that Iranian oil. And so is that going to be stopped by the U.S., or is the U.S. going to be trying to punish China for that? I'll be very curious to see kind of if President Trump sort of wants to make his relationship with the Chinese government more difficult over the Iran issue.
Yeah, but some of the listeners may think, okay, China, they're kind of an adversary anyway. But you heard the clip. It sounds like Bessent and Trump plan to inflict economic pain not just on China, but also on U.S. allies who get oil or do other business with Iran. Do you have a sense of who that might affect and, who the U.S. generally considers an ally, if there's anyone left in that category?
I mean, Iran's trade relationships are, fairly limited because of sanctions, but of course it does buy food from other countries. Up till, I guess, last week or a few days ago, it was doing significant trade with the United Arab Emirates. You might have seen that the UAE, which is, of course, a U.S. ally, has announced that it is cutting off those relationships with Iran. I think that was likely in anticipation of this sort of economic D-Day. And so I think, we have to see, does the U.S. really mean that no trade can occur with Iran? Does that mean, humanitarian goods, food? The extent of this is kind of still unknown, and I think we'll get a better sense both at the press conference and then also the Treasury kind of official announcements and text that comes out. We'll get a much better sense of if there are any exceptions to this, because those exceptions could, turn out to be quite broad and therefore allow some kind of wiggle room even for U.S. allies here.
Oh, which means, do we translate that as, oh yeah, they can talk tough again, but what they're actually going to do isn't actually going to hurt anybody that much, and it's more for domestic consumption in the midterms, or would that be overreading it?
That might be overreading it. I think we just have to wait and see kind of what happens and what it actually looks like. It's just, as you know, kind of covering this over the past few months, it's been quite unpredictable from day to day, and things kind of shift quite rapidly. So I do think that the administration feels that the naval blockade has been effective, and that's kind of, at this point, their best chance of getting Iran to acquiesce. That sort of economic pressure hasn't worked yet, but even a system like Iran's, where there aren't elections that really sort of would determine kind of the people in the top positions, there's not that kind of signal from kind of public opinion that the leaders really have to worry about. Even in a system like that, if an economic pressure kind of increases to a certain point, the leaders have to kind of respond to that. And I think we've seen some of that pressure in the last few days as well in Iran.
Yeah, and I want to ask you in a minute to get more into that, because I don't think the Iran side of what people are feeling there in the general population gets covered all that much in the United States, and you're very strong on that. But before we get to that, is it clear to you what specific demands the U.S. is making to not launch this economic D-Day? Because you referred, and I think Bessent in the clip referred to, it's not just the Strait of Hormuz in the narrow way that it's mostly been covered in the media.
Right. I mean, I think his words, I just wrote them down when the clip was playing, was, basically other countries that want this murderous regime to end. So are they going for toppling the government? I mean, that was sort of what the stated goal was at the beginning of the war in late February and March. That has shifted quite a lot. And I think most recently, the U.S. goal was first and foremost to open up the Strait of Hormuz again, and then secondly, the nuclear program. And putting an end to it, or getting Iran to agree to significant restrictions. The Iranians had basically rejected that. I mean, I think they feel very much that the Iranian government feels that the Strait of Hormuz is some leverage that they've gotten throughout this war that's quite valuable, and they think it's more valuable than the prospect of kind of getting into negotiations, which may or may not deliver, and so they want to very much hold on to that. But now we're seeing kind of, at least the rhetoric from Secretary Bessent is much more expansive than just the Strait of Hormuz. So I'm honestly a bit confused myself as to kind of what is the U.S. goal here.
I was surprised to hear regime change creep back into the language there.
Yeah, and it's hard to... Sorry to interrupt. It's hard to know, is that like a planned strategy that on the part of the U.S. administration, or was he kind of speaking off the cuff? It's a bit unclear, and I think we would want to see a bit more evidence, kind of either from President Trump or from other kind of parts of the government to understand if this is a shift.
Listeners, your questions and comments are welcome about the Iran war standoff, the latest bombastic language from Trump about today being an economic D-Day, Iran's own pressure campaign from its side, the Lebanese factor, Israel-Lebanon factor, and Hezbollah, which we'll get to. Anything else? 212-433, WNYC, 212-433-9692 for Yeganeh Torbati, covering the region, including the war, from Istanbul, and author of a new book called Stolen Revolution, which we will also get to. Call or text 212-433, WNYC 212-433-9692 with your comments, questions, or if you're personally affected in any way, your stories. So, Yeganeh, you wrote an article the other day. I'll read people the headline. As Iran and U.S. settle into an uneasy standoff, who will blink first? Each side seems to believe it can hold out longer than the other. And I think our listeners probably have a fairly good idea of how the U.S. is suffering. I don't think, as I said before, that we hear much in this country about the Iran side of that. So can you put some meat on those bones for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the economy in Iran has been an issue for a really long time. And if your listeners kind of remember, back in late December, early January, when we saw these really mass protests in Iran for the first time in a few years, the spark of that was the economy. And it was a huge drop in the value of the Iranian currency, and just a lot of kind of economic problems that were brewing. The government was sort of signaling that it really didn't have a lot of money in its own budget, and that was just something that people were really feeling, and it kind of led to protests, which were then very brutally suppressed. The economy's only gotten worse since then, and that is due to a couple things. One, the war itself, of course, has hit infrastructure. It has hit Iran's oil production. It's hit its refineries, its petrochemical plants, its steel factories. These are all things that provide jobs. And so those have, there have been factories that have been shut. There have been steel plants that, are only just now kind of getting back online somewhat. So that's been a huge effect. And then, of course, the Iranian government has shut down the internet for weeks during the January protests, and then for months during the war. And that it kind of does that in moments where it's worried about unrest, where it doesn't want people to organize or to kind of have a sense of what's going on outside. And Iran is a country that I think people have really taken to the internet there. So it's a very modern country in that way. A lot of people make their money on social media, or they just rely on the internet like any of us do in any other country for their business, to go to school, to kind of just run their companies. And that had a huge, huge impact on the economy as well. And so now, we're seeing the rial reach new and new lows every kind of day, especially these days. People are out of, there have been layoffs as a result of the war and the internet shutdown. Inflation, already the IMF have been forecasting 70% inflation in Iran this year. My expectation is that, is probably going to go even higher, and it's even higher than that, into the triple digits for just basic food items, things that people need to survive. So it's just been a really difficult year and a half for Iranians. And I think the war sort of exacerbated a lot of the economic hardship that they were already facing.
So how does that suffering come back to haunt the government? You did make a reference before to, how even in an authoritarian country like that shoots maybe tens of thousands of protesters in the streets, when they rise up because of economic dismay, as happened, at the beginning of the year, even in that context, that there is politics at play to some degree. So explain to our listeners a little bit of how that might be.
Yeah, I think obviously Iran is an authoritarian system, and Iran's leaders don't face kind of the pressure. When I say the leaders, of course, there's an elected president, and people go to the ballot box to vote for that person, and can also vote him out. But the people who really have the most power, which are the supreme leader, and then of course the military, they don't face the pressure of the ballot box. So people are suffering, and that doesn't translate immediately into change. I do think that even now, some of Iran's leaders are kind of at least publicly sort of recognizing that the economy is a problem. I think there were some comments a couple of days ago from the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who has also been playing a big role in the negotiations with the U.S., where he basically said that, even if a country has a strong military, if its people are hungry, it's not really safe. But then what does that translate into? Does that actually translate into a deal? Does it translate into a lifting of sanctions that might kind of release some of the pressure on Iranians? It's sort of, there's a gap sometimes between the rhetoric and the action. I do think, at least from what I hear, that pressure is building inside the country. I think people are really at their wits' end with how they can kind of put up with this economic situation, and with the prices really are at where they are at now. There's some, talk of maybe fuel prices increasing because the government can't afford the subsidies that it's been providing on gasoline. There were really big protests that happened in 2019 when the government increased gasoline prices. So I think they're quite wary of that. So without kind of making a prediction about what comes next, I just sense that there is a lot of pressure building within the system. And if we look back over the last, kind of 4 rounds of protests, 3 of them have been sparked by explicitly economic concerns. And this kind of like economic dissatisfaction within Iran sort of goes back many years and has proven, to cause a lot of crises for the government. And so I think that is something that we can expect going forward as well.
Does this even relate to one of the themes of your book, Stolen Revolution, Betrayal and Hope in Modern Iran, where I think you give some of the history of the early days of the regime after the 1979 revolution, where the original Ayatollah Khomeini kind of sounded like a socialist, right? He was saying no one must remain without a dwelling in this country, and was talking about free electricity and things like that. Whereas then he eventually transitioned to saying things like, we're not sacrificing our blood so that melons would become cheap. So am I telling something real here from your book?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very interesting that you said that he sounded kind of like a socialist. I think that's actually not an accident, because in the sort of pre-revolutionary period, there was kind of at least amongst the intellectuals, kind of the leftist sort of strain of thought, and Marxism was quite popular, and I think it was also appealing to many youth at that time. And Khomeini very shrewdly wanted to sort of co-opt that. And so he kind of began using words like the oppressor and the oppressed, which kind of corresponds to, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and presented his, Islamic revolution as one that would deliver social justice. And, upon taking power, he gave a very famous speech where, as you kind of referenced, he said, we're going to have free electricity for the poor, free buses for the poor, we're going to build housing. But his government and he himself kind of proved incapable of that. And I think there are a couple reasons. One is that their ideological motivations were sort of always more important to them than economics. And I think you see it in that quote that Khomeini gave in a speech that actually came just a few months after taking power. I think it was September 1979, where he says, who can imagine? No one can imagine that we did this revolution for economics. We didn't do it for housing to become cheaper. We didn't do it for melons to become cheaper. We did it for Islam. Like, that is why people sacrifice their lives. And I think for a lot of people, well, at least some people then, and then increasingly as the years went on, that was quite disillusioning for them. I think people felt that, we're going to carry out this revolution and our lives are going to be better. And yes, maybe the government will be Islamic as well, but also, we'll be provided for and it'll be kind of a just system. And over time, the government sort of went sort of further and further away from that. Firstly, I think because of those ideological aims, where, that eventually, Iran's ideology, the government's ideology is sort of based around a couple different pillars, one of them being opposition to the US, opposition to Israel. Those, aims sort of eventually led the government into supporting militant groups abroad, pursuing this nuclear program, which then garnered sanctions. And I think the Iranian system has decided at various points that its priority is those ideological aims rather than lifting the sanctions. And then I think the second reason, why people are so unhappy and why the economy hasn't delivered is as the system has gone on over the last 47 years, and we kind of trace this in the book, there's been a great deal of corruption and a kind of small, increasingly small, also group of people and people in power, and in particular the military, have gotten to dominate a greater and greater amount of wealth and business and commerce, and just pushed out anyone who kind of wasn't an insider. And I think that when you put those two phenomena together, you sort of get the system and the economic system that we have right now in Iran.
And with Yeganeh Torbati, who's covering the war in the region from Istanbul for the New York Times, and is co-author now of Stolen Revolution, Betrayal and Hope in Modern Iran, we're getting a call from somebody who says he's in Tehran. Ali in Tehran. You're on WNYC. Yes. Hello.
Yes. Hello. My name is Ali. I am walking the street of Tehran, and usually I listen to your news. Here the weather is very hot, and couple of hours during the 24 hours we don't have electricity. Otherwise, life goes on, and people doing their own things. But often people here, as I am hearing, they are very much worried about the threat that comes from American current officials that they are threatening the Iranian government, but at the end they don't deliver any kind of meaningful result. But as a result of these threats, people get excited and they have a false hope. Maybe some innocent people would be hurt. And, we do not want to hear somebody like Trump goes to the media and said that the help is on the way, just go in the street, and then suddenly everything is okay. I mean, the rest of it. That is the major fear of Iranian people in the streets now.
Yeganeh, would you like to ask this caller a question, being that you're the expert covering the region? Interesting caller.
Oh, yeah, it's incredible that he was able to connect. Ali, I'm just curious, kind of right now with the economic situation, how are people coping with prices? How are you coping? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, all of the supermarkets and bodegas, the streets are full of markets. You could see almost everything, but they are very, very, very expensive. And as a result of it, people could not buy it. Particularly, civil employees or retired people, they have to just minimize their life. But I do not see any unusual situation yet. Everybody are worried about it. They talk about it. There is a long line for gasoline, but that is more as a result of the news that we hear about it. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, if you just do not hear anything and come to a middle-class neighborhood of Tehran, you would think as if nothing is happening in this country.
Ali, thank you so much for checking in. I think you answered Yeganeh's question, and this has been so informative for our listeners. Please call us again. You're very welcome to call us again. And thank you very much for this call. Among other things, I guess we learned, Yeganeh, that they use the word bodegas in Iran, just like they do in New York. But seriously, I mean, among my impressions from that caller is the tension that he feels, and that from reporting I've read, you can confirm this or not, many Iranians feel that, they do want the regime to change and collapse, and for there to be a whole new, maybe more democratic way in the country of Iran. But by the same token, and I think this is in your book too, all they're feeling from the United States and Israeli pressure is pain, not liberation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were a number of Iranians who were heartened by what President Trump said publicly in January when they were protesting. As Ali mentioned, help is on the way, locked and loaded, these sorts of things. I think a lot of people felt to themselves, well, surely there must be a plan, right? Like if he wouldn't just say these things if there wasn't kind of like some thought through plan. And I think over the last few months, the way the war has gone, I think Iranians sort of feel like, well, we kind of got the worst of both worlds. The infrastructure around me, buildings in my neighborhood, etc., are destroyed. Prices are so much higher, and the government is still in place. And in fact, the sort of new crop of leaders that have arisen, I don't want to, I think we often sort of say they're more hardline or whatever. I think that could be argued with. There's some sort of like pragmatists kind of within this group as well. But certainly we've seen, the pace of executions of political prisoners speeding up. We've seen, really harsh crackdown aimed at kind of civil society and not letting dissent, not letting protest happen. And so I think Iranians just feel like, well, we got kind of nothing that we were promised. And in fact, things have gone worse. And we've sort of been sacrificed in the middle of all of this.
Your book, I'll tell our listeners, tells the story of Iran and Iranians through 6 individual Iranians who have had different experiences. Does Ali, in any sense, represent sort of one of those Iranians who you profile?
I don't, so I don't know much about Ali other than it seems like he's sort of in a large city and kind of is seeing kind of the world around him. But I do think that we of course talk to, for instance, and profile kind of young people growing up in kind of Gen Z and sort of try to understand sort of how they felt about this government, having grown up in an era where all they kind of knew of the revolution was from textbooks, and they kind of had access to the internet, and so they were able to sort of get a sense of what life is like outside the country, and could kind of compare it with sort of what they had been given. And I think that was quite a different generation than those that came before, where they didn't have as much access to the outside world. And so they kind of, in a lot of ways, like accepted the framework of the government or of the system. Society was much more conservative back then. I think we've seen huge changes in Iranian society now. And so, so without kind of knowing too much about Ali and his views and his experiences, I think there are a lot of people similar kind of throughout the country.
Another listener writes, please address the fact that America's decades-long sanctions are the main reason Iranians are suffering. How much would you say that's true, speaking of economic suffering?
I think that's one perspective, and I think that's it's probably not something that I would say necessarily as a reporter. I do think that that it's sort of a mix of things. I think that there are people in Iran who certainly have that perspective. There are others who sort of blame the government for pursuing policies that garnered the sanctions. But I think there's certainly a debate to be had about whether the U.S. sanctions policy has been effective, not just in Iran, but kind of all over the world. I think the most probably effective instance of it was actually in regards to Iran with the 2015 nuclear deal, in terms of just kind of achieving the aim that U.S. policymakers had set out, which was to get limits on Iran's nuclear program. Of course, President Trump came in and pulled out of that nuclear deal in 2018. And, then kind of we sort of got on this road to confrontation. But I think, I'm not an advocate sort of either way, but I do think that there is a pretty serious debate going on about kind of the effectiveness of sanctions and whether the U.S. has grown to rely on them too much in order to kind of throw them at sort of every foreign policy problem that it has.
I don't see, I just want to say for the record, since we, previewed it at the beginning of the segment, I don't see that Treasury Secretary Bessent has started his news conference yet as we speak here at exactly 10:30 Eastern Time. How specific do you think he's going to? No. I didn't see a time announced. I'm just noting the time that it is here, and it doesn't look like he's begun. So I'm just curious how specific you think he's going to get about what Trump means by economic D-Day today.
I mean, I don't know how specific he'll get in the announcement in his press conference, but the Treasury, like when sanctions are announced, the Treasury Department has to put out very specific guidance and very specific announcements on who it might be sanctioning and what activities are sanctionable. There's a whole industry of lawyers and businesses that follow these very closely. And so I think, it can't be kind of just a tweet or a statement, in a press conference. We're going to get black and white kind of like real information on who they're actually going to be enforcing this against, what behavior would fall afoul of the U.S. in this case. And so I think, that should all be clarified, I would imagine, by the end of today.
What role is the Israeli offensive in Lebanon or Hezbollah's role versus Israel playing in these latest two-way threats between the U.S. and Iran? Any?
I mean, I think Iran sees what's happening in Lebanon as very much its business. And, a couple weeks ago, a very senior Iranian official kind of announced some sort of preconditions for letting traffic back through the Strait of Hormuz, and one of those was basically to include Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, basically all of Iran's allies in the Middle East. Attacks should stop against them as well. So I think they see that as very important. Of course, I think the Israeli government does not see any agreement that the U.S. would come to Iran as binding on itself. And so that has always had the potential to sort of spoil whatever agreement that the U.S. and Iran eventually come to, although it does feel like we're generally far from an agreement between the U.S. and Iran, even without that issue.
And we have a kind of deep history question along those lines from a listener who writes, I have a question. To this very day, I don't understand what caused Iran to start hating Israel to such an extent or think of them as the ultimate devil, writes that listener. Is it simply solidarity with the Palestinians, or how would you begin to answer that question? As if the answer is complex.
The answer is probably complex, and I'm not the kind of a historian of the Middle East. I don't even really cover the broader region. I really just focus on Iran. But this was a part of Khomeini's ideology even before he took power, even when he was just a cleric kind of in Iran. And he talked about it in speeches, and he hated that the Shah had some sort of relationship, some sort of like diplomatic relationship with Israel. And so I think that was sort of really baked into his worldview. And of course, upon taking power, it kind of became the worldview of the government as well. So it's pretty long standing, and it's really been a key feature of this Iranian government since they took power.
And I think Janet in Manhattan wants to go even further back in history. Janet, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Yes. Yes, I do. We often talk in this country about the relations between Iran and the United States as if it all started just out of a bottle or something in 1979. But you really have to go back to 1953. And I wonder if the Iranian people trust America. How could they really? They have a long memory. Most Americans probably don't know, and I didn't know until relatively recently, what happened in 53. They elected a nice democratically elected leader named Mohammad Mossadegh, and Mohammad Mossadegh wanted to commit the terrible crime, at least in the eyes of British Petroleum, of selling Iranian oil and distributing the profits to the American people.
The Iranian
people. What a concept. So British Petroleum went to President Eisenhower, and this was the height of the Red Scare, and they said, oh, this guy's a communist, he's a communist. So Eisenhower sent Kermit Roosevelt, who was a relation to Theodore Roosevelt, and they ran a coup against Mohammad Mossadegh out of the American embassy, and they destroyed his premiership, and they installed the hated Shah. And so when the people finally got the Shah out, and they took over the embassy. I never understood why that was happening. The hostage taking, when they took hostages in the American embassy, there was a perfectly natural reason they did that. They didn't want another coup by the United States bringing the Shah back. So, and that apparently that had an effect on President Carter, who failed. Remember the plane crash? He failed to rescue the hostages, and maybe.
And I think the Shah by that time was dying and was in a U.S. hospital for some kind of treatment. But Janet, I'm going to leave it there. But she puts, that we could get many, many callers who say, hey, what about Mossadegh, the sort of original sin of the United States in Iran, overthrowing that elected government and installing the Shah? Does that basic description, just that sort of headline version of that history hold up in your understanding of Iran?
Janet really knows her history. I think, of course, that is a factor, and I think that can't be overlooked kind of in the overall sort of historical memory of Iranians in the 20th century, which was one of sort of domination by world powers. And this was also stretching back to World War II and how they were treated by the Russians and the British. And so I think, that was in people's memory. And so when Khomeini sort of began speaking about independence and self-sufficiency and sort of criticizing the Shah as a lackey of the US, like that really resonated with people, and I think was kind of part of the motivation for the revolution. On the other hand, the scholar Ray Takei has made this point. I think both, what he says is that both the US and Iran are really absorbed kind of in their own history. So for the US, that trauma, of course, is the hostage crisis. And that really left a mark on Americans of that generation. And for Iranians, it's both, I think, maybe 1953, but even more so for this generation of leaders, the Iran-Iraq War and the fact that the US and the world community really was either neutral or was helping Iraq in that war, and it was quite a brutal war. So I think both sides sort of have these grievances. And if we look to other countries where the U.S. has had a terrible history, Vietnam comes to mind, the leaders of those countries have often been able to sort of move forward, right? And now the U.S. and Vietnam have a good relationship, and Vietnam, kind of is able to, they've sort of moved on from that. And I think, Vietnam has pursued policies that benefit its own people, and it's not sort of nurturing kind of this grudge or has this sort of difficult relationship with the U.S. And I think, there's a question of whether these two countries, the U.S. and Iran, would be able to kind of move past their own history in a way that I think a lot of people would think would be kind of beneficial, at least to the people of both. And for the Iranian people, of course, that would mean sort of getting access to world markets and kind of not having this sort of enmity continue.
So last question, and you've been so informative, and we really appreciate your reporting and your description of some of it, as well as your book, with us today. Do you see the outlines of a deal even now amid this lengthy stalemate between the U.S. and Iran, which you've reported on in such depth?
It's really hard. I mean, Iran put forward a bunch of kind of prerequisites almost for getting the strait reopened that I find it very difficult to see.
Oh,
the
I've got
US
that
agreeing
here
to.
from one of your articles. I'm just going to read that out for our listeners.
Sure.
It says, let's see, for the United States to lift its naval blockade and sanctions on Iran, withdraw the U.S. military from around Iran, pay war reparations, and release frozen Iranian assets, as well as end attacks on Iran's allies in the region. I assume that would mean the proxy groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and threats against the country. So that's a lot from their side.
It's a lot, and it's lifting sanctions. Like I read the statement that this Iranian official put out with those conditions over and over, and I compared them to the memorandum of understanding. Basically, they want kind of all the things that had been envisioned as part of a final nuclear deal. They want that kind of upfront. And I think the reason for that is that they don't trust the U.S. And they don't trust this process to eventually actually lead to all of those benefits. And so they think to themselves, okay, we've got this straight. We're going to hold on to it as long as we can. So given that that's the dynamic, it's just really hard for me right now to see an actual eventual deal. We also saw the last deal they signed in June fall apart in a matter of weeks. So at this point, it's a bit, it's probably dangerous to predict anything these days, but it's at least hard for me to foresee.
By the way, I see now that the Scott Bessent News Conference on this so-called economic D-Day is scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time. We thank Yeganeh Torbati, covering the war and Iran in general from Istanbul for the New York Times, and co-author now of Stolen Revolution, Betrayal and Hope in Modern Iran. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.